Hello and welcome to a conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Nassim Ahmed and I will be your host for today's discussion, which is a really important one based on what's been happening over the past 5 years with regards to allegations of anti-Semitism. We saw that at the peak of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership in the Labour Party. I have someone with me who can provide more insight and background on the IHRA, the International Holocaust Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which has been the standard definition over the past few years. I'm delighted to have with me Professor James Renton. James, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So James Renton is a professor of history and co-lead of the Racial Justice and Migration Research Group, Edge Hill University in UK. He is also a former president of the British and Irish Association for Jewish Studies. Professor Renton is a historian of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, empire, and global politics. So this discussion comes on the back of an article which James published on the Middle East Monitor following a number of years of studies. He's also published a paper on this topic on the origins of the IHRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. From now on, we'll just stick to the abbreviation IHRA. But before we dive into some of the details of the article, James, I just want to begin by you giving us your explanation of what the IHRA actually is, because some of our viewers may not be familiar with it.
Thank you very much, Nassim. I think that's actually a really profound question, really important, because this question of the definition of anti-Semitism has become so important in national politics in different parts of Europe and in North America, but also global politics. And the acronym IHRA is bandied around and people talk about it all the time, but nobody really discusses what the IHRA is. And it actually has a lot of implications for our understanding of the work that it does and how it should be approached with regard to questions of anti-Semitism. So the first thing that's really significant is the IHRA is not a civil society organization. It's not a campaigning group. It's not an NGO. It's not a group of academic experts on Holocaust memory or anti-Semitism. It is in fact a group of states, of governments that have come together around the question of originally just Holocaust memorialization and education and research. But the key point is that it is a group of states. It is a non-Jewish initiative. It starts at the end of the 20th century, after the end of the Cold War. And of course, the work of any interstate organization is informed by experts. It's not just something that is run by government bureaucrats and policymakers. Whatever the subject would be, you'd expect that to be the case. So of course, it consults with and is informed by the advice of specialists in the area around Holocaust remembrance and research and education. But it's really key to note that this is an organization formed by and run by states and for the benefit of governments. And that really core fact has got really lost in all of the polemics, the discussions about that organization's definition of anti-Semitism.
So if you don't mind me just digging a bit deeper, so which states, I mean, as I said, over the past many years, especially since 2015, the IHRA became the I would say, the cornerstone of fighting anti-Semitism, led here in the UK and elsewhere as well. And many Jewish organizations in the UK were pushing for the adoption of the IHRA. But you're saying its origin lies in states and not particularly Jewish organizations, but it is favored by Israel. So, which states are the key actors in the adoption of the IHRA or the dissemination of the IHRA as being the standard accepted working definition, as is called?
Okay, so the IHRA is originally founded by 3 states. So it's founded by Sweden, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Now, today, the majority of the members of the alliance, as it's now called, are from the European Union. So almost all of the European Union are members of this alliance, but it also has key members outside, and the most notable, significant one is the United States. And the United States has a really important role in the foundation of the IHRA, in its development, but also the work that it starts to do later on with regard to anti-Semitism. But actually, the definition of anti-Semitism that is adopted by the IHRA in 2016 has a longer history, and that's actually outside of the alliance. But crucially, what's the connection is that definition is the product of work by, again, governments. And it's in a different context. The context is in the run by the OSCE, so the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. It's as you can tell by the name of the organization, it's a security entity to promote security, to protect democracy. And that is the organization that has its first international conference in 2003 around the issue of anti-Semitism. And that was the first time that there was an international conference on that issue. And it was actually, even though it was held by the OSCE, and that organization carried on holding international conferences about anti-Semitism, significantly, the one state that pushed for that to happen was the United States. It was the government of George W. Bush, and it was in the context, of course, of the beginnings of the war on terror. The conference took place a few months after the invasion of Iraq, and all of these issues are interconnected. So that particular moment, that particular conference, which takes place, the first one in Vienna, was as a result of concerns in the Bush administration around opposition, hostility towards the State of Israel, particularly in Europe, in the context of the Second Intifada, which in turn was, of course, in the context of the war on terror and the aftermath of 9/11. This particular period, now, of course, the Second Intifada begins before 9/11, the year before, in the year 2000. But the wave of support for Palestinians in Europe really reaches a fever pitch on the eve of the invasion of Iraq in 2002 into 2003. And the conference was based upon the idea that there's a new form of anti-Semitism, a new wave of anti-Semitism, which was focused on, and they use this term, the new anti-Semitism, and it was focused on the idea that anti-Semitism was now being concentrated on the Jewish state, on the state of Israel, and in particular was being perpetrated by Muslims, especially in Europe. And this is what leads to the conference around anti-Semitism in Vienna in 2003. And the thrust of that, the tenor of it was such that the representative to the OSCE who was there on behalf of Turkey actually made a statement during the conference where he feared that the discussions about anti-Semitism were veering towards Muslim bashing. And he was acutely concerned about this development. But this is the new international political consensus in the West that's emerging at that time and at that conference.
Sorry, James, before we move on, exploring how the IHRA became an instrument and a tool to during the post 9/11 world to suppress Muslim political activism and all those other things. Just help us understand, first of all, why the IHRA was so heavily pushed by the UK, the US, and I think you mentioned other European countries. IHRA specifically, in contrast to some of the other definitions of anti-Semitism, you could probably mention like there's a Nexus definition, there's a Jerusalem definition. The IHRA in particular, it seeks to defend Israel from criticism. 7 of the 11 examples cited in the IHRA mentions Israel specifically. Why wouldn't that be something Israel pushes for its adoption? Why isn't that something, say, a Zionist organization in the US, in the UK, and elsewhere, who feel that support for Israel is part of their identity, support for Zionism is part of their identity, and here is a definition which protects this criticism of what would be core part of their identity. So the question is, just help us understand why wouldn't Israel, the Zionist organizations across the West, why isn't it them that would push for the adoption of the IHRA instead of the states?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really, really important question. And ultimately, it boils down to one of power in the international arena. Because Israel, the state of Israel, the government of Israel, rather, for a very long time, has campaigned and worked to try to counter political critiques of its policies with regard to Palestinians and all sorts of other issues concerned with the state of Israel. Lots of lobbying work, lots of activity, like all states, right? Promoting their goals, justifying their agenda. Also, we have various Jewish organizations supporting Israel, in addition, campaigning against anti-Semitism, and also there are some, such as the American Jewish Committee, for example, in North America in the 1990s, concerned about opposition to Israel. The point that I'd like to make as an historian of these issues is that we have to distinguish between groups who are pursuing activities and trying to make their voices heard, and the question of whether or not they have any impact. So whenever we're talking about the relationship between Israel and the West, a lot of people by default who are trying to figure out why on earth is the West increasingly identifying itself with Israel, no matter what Israel is doing, for example, in Gaza. It's a source of great confusion for a lot of people. And so in trying to understand that, people think, well, it must be because Israel's got some sort of significant influence in Western states, or that Jewish lobbying groups have a great deal of influence, and they're sort of steering the West towards their own agenda. And you see this most recently as well amongst far right commentators like Tucker Carlson in North America, who sort of got on this bandwagon, and lots of discussions about nefarious Israeli influence over the United States government against the interests of America. Actually, the real answers to these questions are more complex, and the issue of Israeli and Jewish influence is a real red herring. The fact is that before the end of the 20th century, yes, okay, Israeli intelligence was keen to try to promote Israeli perspectives on all of these issues, but they weren't getting anywhere. They weren't having an impact. What people have to understand is that before the end of the 1990s, the Western governments had very little interest at all in questions that we now take for granted as being part of the international firmament. Things like Holocaust memorialization. You know, people who were trying to, Jews who were campaigning for people to remember and commemorate the Holocaust were banging their heads against the wall for decades, and nobody was interested. Nobody was listening. You know, in the 1980s, do you know what the only memorial to the Holocaust in the UK was? Is a small garden in Hyde Park with a few boulders that the government really wasn't interested in supporting, and it came from the Jewish community. The only state outside of Israel that had an official national memorial to the Holocaust before we get to the end of the Cold War was the United States. But the United States ends up supporting that project under the Carter administration at the end of the 1970s, going into the 1980s, because it was seen as a useful way by the Carter administration to try and assuage the concerns of Jewish voters who were preoccupied by Carter's evangelical Christianity and his concern for the Palestinians. In actual fact, Carter wasn't particularly interested in Holocaust memorialization. The US government was hardly involved in the establishment of that memorial that ends up becoming the Holocaust National Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. It doesn't open until 1993. The fact is that even though we see going back to the 1960s, the government of the State of Israel utilizing Holocaust memory to try to, as a way of rallying support for Zionism, in the international arena, it was getting absolutely nowhere. Nowhere. And so if we're trying to understand why we now live in a world in which Western states and international, transnational government institutions, the United Nations, have now a Holocaust Memorial Day, are committed to Holocaust memorialization as a key plank of liberal democracy, we're not going to find the answers by looking at some sort of imagined influence by the State of Israel or Jewish organizations. The answer is elsewhere. And it's particularly, I argue, because after the end of the Cold War, liberal democracy needed a new purpose, a new justification. Now, we often think about the end of the Cold War in the West as this moment of tremendous
Sorry, Jen, that's a really important part of the conversation, which I want to get to. But before we do that, I just wanted to push you back on your framing, or maybe get a bit more explanation on your framing, because I think the West seeing its core identity being attached to the preservation of Israel is a really, really important topic in itself, and we want to get to that. But so one of the arguments that's being that's been pushed for many years, especially by people like Mersha Martin Waltz, is that there is an Israeli lobby. The Israeli lobby is strong and powerful. And that's the reason why the West, in particular the US, is so wedded to the interest of Israel. That's a dominant narrative. I know you're not saying the Israeli lobby has no influence whatsoever, but you're saying that influence is over exaggerated, and there are other reasons why the US, the UK also are so closely aligned to Israel, reasons which we'll get to later. So are you kind of pushing back on uh, which is one of the key arguments or dominant narratives of the past 3 decades, which is that the Israeli lobby has massive sway on Western policymaking over Israel?
Yeah, absolutely. I push back against that whole argument. And I think it's understandable when we get caught in our current moment to be um, focused and influenced by its political dynamics, right? So it's clearly the fact now in 2025 that Western states, uh, for the most part, are completely wedded to, at least in public, being seen in lockstep with Israel no matter what. But what I would encourage people to do is to think, even just uh, back just a couple of decades, to see how this is actually an innovation in international history. This is something new. If we go back to the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948, the fact is, at that time and going into the 1950s, one of the big concerns for the people who were leading the State of Israel was to try to convince Western states to support it, to back it publicly. And there was this huge international scandal crisis in 1956, where Israel, France, and the UK secretly conspired behind closed doors to try to topple the government of Egypt. And the key point about the Suez Crisis for me in relation to Israel is that all of that was done in secret, because Western governments at that time were more concerned about making sure that they had strong relations with Arab states in the context of the Cold War than with Israel. Israel was something of an embarrassment. And you can see going through into the 60s and the 70s that there was this ambivalent relationship with Israel amongst Western states, where, yes, of course, there was support from states, but it was always conditional and limited. Most notably, there is a point in the Yom Kippur War in 1973 where there's a crisis between Israel and what people see as its biggest backer, the United States, as to whether the United States was going to help Israel at the moment where it looked like it was about to be defeated for the first time. Fast forward into the 1980s, and you can see there that it's the crisis after the first Intifada and the situation around Iraq that leads to the first Gulf War in 1991, where you see the United States is pushing Israel towards an agreement with the PLO, not because Israel wanted it. Israel didn't want to go down that path. They didn't want to go down that path at all. But it was important for United States geopolitical interests. And the point I want to make is that throughout history, from the moment that Israel is created, the West relationship with it is always determined by cold calculations by the West about their own interests. And Israel would sometimes dovetail with those interests, but not always. And it's really a mistake to confuse the situation after 9/11 with what happens before it. After 9/11 is different. After 9/11, the West, particularly the United States, sees itself in an existential conflict with Islamism. And it comes to see Israel as its existential partner. that the West is either going to remain or fall in tandem with Israel. But this is a recent development, and that I think that's absolutely.
Yes. So in your article, you make two key points. One is that there is the use of the weaponization of the IHRA to go after Muslims, and it's seen as it's a way to crack down on Muslim activism in the West. And the other argument you make is that support for Israel is part of the identity of the West, the liberal West. And maybe before you get to the IHRA being weaponized, speak to that a little bit more. The idea that because that also kind of counters what you're saying in a sense, which is that the US, for example, was not too interested in Israel until, say, 1967, when it saw Israel as being a dominant regional power by defeating the Arab countries, Egypt, in 6 days. And then it saw, like Joe Biden once said, if there was no Israel, we would have to invent an Israel, meaning that Israel is a major US ally, and through Israel, we will have a garrison in the Middle East to push back against Arab nationalism, political Islam, or anyone, or communism before that, or anyone who threatened America's interest, in particular the extraction of oil from the Middle East. So there is that hard reasoning, rationale for why the West would support Israel. But you also mentioned that there is an ideological element to that, which is that the West sees Israel as a liberal country, and therefore putting aside the hard rational reasons. What is the ideological reason? Because now, if you look at Israel, Israel is, many would say, it's an apartheid state. It's committing genocide. It's completely divorced from any of the values of the West. So, what's the ideological connection there?
Thank you, Nassim. Yes, so this is a part of the story that begins in the 1990s, and it's new from that point. And that is because this is the moment in which the Cold War comes to an end. And many people think of that moment as being celebrated in the West with great enthusiasm, even euphoria, of victory for liberal democracy, for capitalism. But actually, if you look beneath the hood, leaders in the West, as we get into the 1990s, were really worried about the future. They started to see the rise of the far right. They started to see people actually, with that, now that communism was gone, not being so committed to the idea of liberal democracy. And they needed a new injection of meaning into what liberal democracy was all about. What was its purpose? And starting with the United States and the Swedish government, because the Swedish government started to see this within their own borders early on, and the United Kingdom under Tony Blair and the Labour government, they come together and they start to see Holocaust memorialization as a key way of injecting meaning into liberal democracy. And the organization, the IHRA, it's founded under a different name in 1998, and they have an international conference in the year 2000 in Stockholm. And there at that conference, they issue a declaration that sets out their objectives and their beliefs with regard to the importance of Holocaust memorialization. And as part of that, they make the statement that the Holocaust, the extent of the Holocaust, is something that will always have universal meaning. And this notion of the Holocaust having universal meaning is really at the core of the West's relationship with it from that point, because the West needed meaning. The liberal democratic state, without the threat of communism, needed meaning. And this is where we see the beginnings of a preoccupation with Holocaust memorialization as providing meaning for liberal democracy. So all of that comes about not as a result of any Jewish lobbying. It's not the result of lobbying by the State of Israel. And in actual fact, at the first conference, which the French Prime Minister Lionel Jospin called the first World Conference of the 21st century, at that conference, there were no discussions about Israel and Zionism. That was not the concern at all. The State of Israel was there. It becomes a member of what's now known as the IHRA, but it's not a founding member of the organization. You know, these states came to this issue independently because they saw the Holocaust as having profound importance, not for the identity of Europeans. You know, states don't go to war, whether that's metaphorically or literally, in the name of identity. But political philosophy is significant. It does have consequences. And the point is that from that moment, at the start of the 21st century, before 9/11, Holocaust memorialization starts to be completely intertwined with the whole purpose, the meaning of liberal democracy. And so if anybody was attacking Holocaust memory, it soon becomes synonymous with attacking liberal democracy itself. And this is where Israel comes in, because Israel, with regard to Holocaust memorialization, for states in the West, Israel is the ultimate totem. It's the ultimate symbol of remembering, of commemorating the lessons of the Holocaust. The idea of Jewish self-determination as the ultimate way of demonstrating that the Holocaust didn't ultimately succeed.
So here you have a new reframing of what liberal democracy means, and an adoption of a definition of anti-Semitism, which maps out the global, well, the political currents of the time. And in mapping that out, who are they envisaging as the actors, entities which needs to be silenced, or against whom this definition needs to be deployed against? Who are they? What is the landscape? What is the map of the political arena at the time, which required them to adopt the IHRA and use that against to silence those who criticize not Israel, but in you're saying a core fundamental plank of the West, which is support for Israel.
Thanks. Actually, historically, it's significant to note that the definition that was adopted by the IHRA was not actually created by the IHRA. And it's not adopted by them until 2016, which is in the context of the rise of Islamic State and its terror campaign in Europe. But initially, the definition was, excuse me, it was drafted, adopted at the start of 2005 by the European, the EU's monitoring centre for xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism. And the immediate context of that draft that was put together by the EUMC is really key for us to understand this whole story. So I mentioned earlier that there was an international conference organized by the OSCE in 2003 in Vienna. And that conference, the real consensus was about that there's a new anti-Semitism afoot, and that this anti-Semitism is all about attacking Israel. And you said, who are the people who are seen as being the guilty party? Who are the perpetrators of anti-Semitism that this definition is supposed to be
Deployed against?
Exactly. it's actually rather nebulous. It's very vague, but essentially it is the Muslim populations of Europe who are attacking Israel in the context of the Second Intifada. And you can see the focus of the concern with Islamism if you actually just take a moment to look at the definition. The first example, the number one priority example of anti-Semitism in the definition that these days people never talk about because it doesn't really compute. What's it got to do with anything? Is that the number one example is the killing or harming of Jews, of people in the name of an extremist or religious ideology. And it's clearly framed with regards to Islamism, right? And it's in the context after 9/11, the war on terror, the preoccupation with Al-Qaeda. And you can see that in the 2003 conference, so the United States has a huge delegation for that conference, and it's led by Rudolph Giuliani, right? The former mayor of New York City, the big hero of 9/11. And he's sent by the George Bush administration to speak for them. And when he goes to the conference, he makes clear that he wants to have more data on anti-Semitism in Europe. He also wants to have, as he puts it, disciplining of debate around Israel, Palestine. And he wants to enlist Muslims in criticizing anti-Semitism. It's clear that Muslim hostility towards Israel is a preoccupation for the Giuliani delegation. But they want to collect data about anti-Semitism. And it's not a coincidence. The war on terror, one of the key weapons of the war on terror is surveillance. It's surveillance of potential terrorists anywhere you might find them around the world. And who are the potential terrorists? Of course, in the context of war on terror, potential terrorists are Muslims. What actually do we mean by surveillance? We mean the observation of populations through the collection of information, of data. And Giuliani is calling for data about anti-Semitism. And it's no coincidence that it's after that call for data that we see, as we get into 2004, with the second OSCE conference on anti-Semitism, where crucially they identify anti-Semitism as a question of security for the West. Right? So it's not just about campaigning against prejudice. It's a question of protecting the security of the West. Right? And it's only at that point that we see around the European Monitoring Center, in collaboration with others, including the American Jewish Committee, under the supervision of the OSCE. And the OSCE has made various statements in that same period where it was committing its members to the surveillance of anti-Semitism to be coordinated by the OSCE. To this day, the OSCE collects hate crime data on anti-Semitism. And this is the starting point of that. And the definition was designed to enable data collection. And so one of the people who drafted it, Kenneth Stern, who worked for the American Jewish Committee, said in testimony, congressional testimony at the House of Representatives, sworn testimony, that the definition was designed to make the job easier for people collecting data around anti-Semitism, so that it was absolutely clear going through the examples that they provide. That's why they have examples. So you can identify quite clearly behaviors and beliefs that fit the bill. Now, this is unprecedented in the history of anti-racism. There are no similar definitions of racism that are employed by government agencies or intergovernmental organizations before this point. Didn't exist, right? Why is that the case? Because actually this kind of tick box exercise for identifying behaviors and beliefs belongs much more in anti-terror surveillance rather than the history of anti-racism. And the whole phenomenon, international phenomenon of what today is often referred to as countering violent extremism and other methods for identifying individuals who are on the journey to becoming a terrorist, this issue of tick box approaches to is someone showing evidence of a behavior or belief that fits the bill for suggesting they're becoming an extremist. That's standard. In the UK, it's called the approach to prevent, but internationally, it's part of a discipline, academic discipline called countering violent extremism. And the structure of the definition of anti-Semitism to identify behaviors and beliefs through examples is something that we see in the guidance that is given to people working in public sector organizations and all sorts of other places that have a legal duty now, a statutory duty to identify people who are at risk of becoming an extremist or terrorist. And that is the context of that definition and how it was structured when it was first written in 2005.
So I'm conscious of time, and I want to get one last question in. So you're saying that the IHRA is less about combating real anti-Semitism, and it's more about cracking down on a rise of criticism of Israel, especially coming from within the Muslim community, within the context of a post 9/11 world, where there is where you see more securitization. We are moving into more of a police state, authoritarian state, and IHRA became codified in order to help identify possible radicalization, possible extremism within the Muslim community. Has that how has that been viewed within the Jewish community? I mean, if you look at, for example, many of the Zionist organizations in Israel, it would gladly accept the adoption of the IHRA because it's seen as a way to crack down on pro-Israeli criticism. But within the Jewish community, has that actually made Jews safe, would you say? And are there Jews who are opposed to this definition because they understand clearly that the IHRA is, instead of going after real anti-Semitism, it's going after people who are criticizing Israel legitimately in most cases? What's the mood and sentiment, or if there is any pushback from within the Jewish community?
Thanks, Nassim. Well, speaking as a Jewish person, who grew up in North London, I can say that whenever you get two Jews in a room, you end up with at least three opinions. We're always arguing with each other, right? And questions about Israel and anti-Semitism are no different. There's all sorts of different opinions, but it's also important to understand that, you know, Jews are just part of wider society, right? And over a significant period of time now, and certainly since, you know, the period around the rise of Islamic State, many Jews feel unsafe, and they do see ideological attacks on Israel as threatening the safety of Jews. And that's how many people perceive the issue. And it's important that we take people's feelings very seriously. But we also have to understand how did we get to this point? So there's a lot of talk when people sometimes people who are feeling vulnerable and worried, and they hear people criticizing Israel and they hear people supporting the Palestinian cause, they immediately start to talk about, you know, are we physically as Jews at threat? And, you know, is this are we along the path to another Holocaust? And as an historian, that is a really intriguing phenomenon to try to understand. And I think that one of the major problems in all of this huge mess that we're all now in about this global politics of Israel-Palestine, that's having all sorts of ramifications, is the way in which the Holocaust and the memorialization of the Holocaust has become completely intertwined with how people understand anti-Semitism. And it's a real problem because in the history of anti-Semitism over millennia, the norm was not for anti-Semites to attempt to murder all Jews, right? The genocide of the Holocaust in the history of anti-Semitism is actually not, as some would suggest, the culmination, the obvious culmination of all of that prejudice and discrimination and oppression over millennia. It's not at all. It actually stands out as completely different to the anti-Semitism that Jews, such as my grandparents and my great-grandparents, and whether it was people in Western Europe or Eastern Europe, that is not what they encountered. That is not the anti-Semitism of history. And I think we need to make sure that we really separate out in a very clear manner Holocaust memorialization, which is important, and it's what people wanted for decades, and we're not getting any, and the serious study of what is anti-Semitism as a form of racism. When people are anti-Semitic, when people have ideas around Jewish conspiracies and they dislike Jews and they associate Jews with what the government of Israel is doing, that doesn't mean that we're on the verge of another Holocaust. We're dealing with a different phenomenon. And because these things are getting all mixed up, it is leading to tremendous anxiety among Jews that they're assuming that when they hear prejudice towards Jews and criticism of Israel, that suddenly it's that what are the next steps? What's it going to? Oh, it's going to genocide. Well, no, it isn't. It absolutely isn't. But because these two things of Holocaust memorialization and anti-Semitism have become so intertwined in international politics, it's leaving actual Jewish people really frightened and confused. And so what we really need is a proper academic, sophisticated understanding of anti-Semitism as it is today and historically that is connected to but separate from our understanding of the Holocaust. Because at the moment we're in this sort of mass catastrophizing phase, which
So
is
for
just
people, sorry, Jay. So people, the key takeaway from today's conversation, what would you want that to be? Because we've said a lot, and you're ending on a really crucial topic, saying that, you know, we have our understanding of anti-Semitism or general understanding of anti-Semitism is very detached from history. It's not grounded in reality. And there is a common sense that, you know, there's left anti-Semitism, there's right anti-Semitism, and they're both just as bad as each other. And that seems to be the binary understanding of anti-Semitism that people have at the moment. But are they the same, the left anti-Semitism and the right anti-Semitism? And what would be your key message to people who are thinking about these things, you know, thinking about Israel, thinking about the rise of anti-Semitism? What would you want them to take away with? Because most people will say, you know, criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism. That's completely different to what we know anti-Semitism to be throughout history, which you're trying to explain. That's very different. Hatred for Jews is very different to criticism of Israel, and we know that. We clearly understand that, but that seems to have been lost.
Thank you. Yes, so I think what we need is a much more sophisticated understanding of anti-Semitism that centers the expertise of academic researchers that separates out the history and the memorialization of the Holocaust from anti-Semitism across a long history. And that long historical perspective is really, really important to understand what continues and what changes over time, so we can have perspective. And perspective, historical perspective, is what we all sorely need right now.
Thank you. So on that note, there's so much more we could talk about, James. I really appreciate your time, and hope we can do this again soon. So for those of you who want to read James's article, it's on MEMO. You can find it there. Muslim Surveillance: The Real Story Behind IHRA Definition of Anti-Semitism. And James also there's links to some of his other studies there as well. You can find. So do search the article and his work on anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and Jewish history in general. Thank you so much, and thank you also for tuning in. See you for another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Bye-bye.